Alrighty, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. On the program, we return to our All Things Africa edition, our journey across the continent, and looking at the history and current affairs of each nation. We're continuing looking at Central Africa, and we now explore the country known as Central African Republic. And we are joined once again, it's our returning champion, the brilliant historian, journalist, and activist Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire, and also frequent contributor to Black Agenda Reports, who will be our guide on this trip to the CRA's history and current affairs. So, Abayomi, welcome back to the program, and of course, always an honor and a real privilege to have you as our history teacher.
Well, thank you so much, and it's always a pleasure to come on, and I appreciate your continued interest in the work that I'm doing on African affairs.
Well, likewise, and also always my thanks and always deep appreciation for you taking the time to come on. And as always, folks, please donate generously to Pan African Newswire and Black Agenda Reports, and please donate generously if you can to One Plus One. Share all of our content, past and present. Help us overcome the far right algorithms and help us overcome the monopoly that Western corporate media and state media has in the social media world by sharing One Plus One's content and again donating to us. And now to the topic at hand. So tell us, Abayomi, as always, what can you share with our audience on Central African Republic? What was it like before French colonization?
It was a country that was moving along in regard to its own historical development. They have physical evidence that there was human presence there at least 10,000 years ago. You had so-called hunting and gathering societies, which later transformed into agricultural production societies. They produced sorghum, millet, and other forms of agricultural products. And later, there was the formation of large-scale human settlements in the Central African Republic. We have to remember that these countries only became divided as a result of colonialism and imperialism.
Okay.
So you have a connection between what is today known as the Democratic Republic of Congo and Gabon, Cameroon, along with what is today known as the Central African Republic. So yes, these areas, these territories did have connections. They did have traditional societies within them. And of course, this was disrupted as a result of the Atlantic slave trade and later colonialism on the part of France, as well as Germany. We have to remember that there was a big struggle between France and Germany over the control of territory in Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, as well as West Africa. So this is very, very important to realize that you had the formation of human settlements, which in all likelihood represented civilizations and cultures which go back thousands upon thousands of years, long before Europe emerged as a major center of economic development and political power.
Fascinating. Now, so now tell us about French colonization of Central African Republic, and as always, what were some of the hideous racist practices that the French did, as well as the tribalism, sectarianism the French exploited and fanned the flames. And my stupid follow-up question is, what a French colonial legacy still impacts the car to this day?
Well, yes, you had the intervention, full-scale intervention in the 1880s of the French imperialists under the guise of exploration and later, of course, exploitation. In the Central African Republic, you had the extraction of rubber. And as a result of that, it became very, very intense in regard to the political and coercive mechanisms and methods that were used in order to extract labor as well as resources from the African people. So Germany was involved in the initial onslaught into the territory, and also France as well. So both these colonial powers were competing against each other for economic and political control of the country. They utilized military means for doing this. And of course, in response to both the German and the French intervention, there were rebellions that took place. The so-called Baya rebellion, which occurred during that particular time period in the western part of the Central African Republic. And that, of course, impacted not only what today is considered the Central African Republic, but also Cameroon, which was a place of contested allegiances as related to France as well as Germany. So also that spread to other areas of Central Africa and West Africa as well. So during the first half of the 20th century, the Baya were involved in rebellions during that particular time period as well, against Germany and later against France in the 1920s. And they fought valiantly against the colonial powers, but eventually were overcome and dominated, dispersed. They were subjected to forced labor and all types of other forms of coercion and exploitation, forced labor, the burning down of villages, the raping of women, the placing of indigenous people into camps in similar fashions that took place in other parts of Africa. We saw that the Germans did this in Namibia. They did it in Tanganyika. They did it in Cameroon, Togo as well. And the French followed a very similar pattern as well. So these things were going on, but the African people were also rebelling against the French colonial onslaught inside that country. And that's important to recognize that these rebellions took place from Algeria, which was also under French control, all the way down to other parts of the African continent, the Republic of Congo, Brazzaville, which we talked about last week.
Yeah.
Was the focus as well of rebellion against the colonial authorities. So despite the suppression and repression and exploitation and even genocide and displacement, people still found means of organizing and rebelling against European imperialism. So you had these rebellions that took place, and the Congo Wara Rebellion was another one against the Curvy French forced labor system that took place during the 1920s. People were forced to collect resources, but also to work on what became known as the Congo Ocean Railway. They used forced labor for this purpose. And people talk about, some historians talk about how European colonialism brought economic development to Africa. But if you looked at the projects that they were forced to work on, they only served European colonialism and imperialism. So the rail lines that were built were designed to take goods and resources from the interior to the coastlines. That was the only purpose of it. It was not designed to improve the living conditions of the African people who were subjected to near slave-like conditions. And this is in the second decade of the last 20th century.
Wow, fascinating. And I think, and I think the fact of the matter is, I think if you look at any African country, including those which are former French colonies, you can see that you can see that so much of that hideous legacy and those business practices are still are still in place. And that's a perfect segue to my third question, which is, how did Central African Republic become independent? Was it a peaceful transition or one of violent upheaval? And then my follow-up question to that is, how did General Jean-Bedel Bokassa become a dictator of the country, and how do you assess? And how do you assess his legacy?
Well, there was a lot of unrest from the 1880s all the way through the 1920s. Of course, World War One. There was a conflict between France and Germany over the control of territories on the African continent. This split, in some cases, allegiances of the African people between France and Germany. Others wanted total independence from them. And of course, one of the French colonial administrators who was under the person we talked about last week, Brazza, who Congo Brazzaville is named after him. His name was Antoine Mizon. He lived from about the 1850s up until 1899. He was appointed as the colonial administrator in the Central African Republic, but he was under Brazza, who was based in Brazzaville on the coast of the west coast of the Atlantic during that particular time period. So they were involved in suppressing and exploiting the African people during this particular time period. And then later on, we had the intervention of Germany against France. And then, of course, eventually the French won out during World War One, and they became dominant. The Germans were forced to relinquish their colonies in Africa during World War One, and in fact, after World War One. Even in 1911, there was a conflict going on between French and German forces, involved Morocco as well as other countries further west and south on the African continent. And of course, the French eventually won out in this conflict as well. So yes, the Congo Wara Rebellion, led by a man named Carnot, had a tremendous impact from the 1920s, and it extended all the way into the 1940s. In fact, Carnot was assassinated by the French, but the rebellion continued for another 3 years. He was killed around 1928, but the rebellion continued till 1931. But it also created a legacy of resistance. And that went on deep into the 1940s, and a man by the name of Barthélemy Boganda became a nationalist leader during the 1940s who was pushing against European colonial rule. He became part of the French colonial parliamentary system, which they established as a mechanisms of reform during World War II. Last week, we talked about how there was a conference held in Brazzaville in 1944, where the French introduced their new revised colonial system.
Yeah, exactly.
In 1940, of course, the Nazis marched into France. They largely took over the country, but there was resistance. And then, of course, Charles de Gaulle was appointed as the titular head of Free France, and he was supported by the Allied forces. So in 1944, they set up a new revised and, quote, more liberalized, unquote, colonial system at a conference in Brazzaville. And of course, this created the openings for some African politicians and organizers to have representation in Africa as well as in France. So Boganda was a leader. He set up and built a political party called Maison. It's a movement for the liberation of Africa. And they were demanding independence during the 1950s. And then, of course, unfortunately, in 1959, he was assassinated. Actually, he died in a plane crash, which is very suspicious.
Okay.
The French said it was an accident. This is in 1959. But then later, in a subsequent investigation, there were some traces of explosives that were found on the aircraft in which he went down in. So this was in 1959. And then after that, a man took over by the name of David Darko, and he took
Okay.
over the Maison Party. They became the dominant party after 1960 when the country gained independence. In 1958, de Gaulle went around the African continent and offered the colonies to participate in a broader French political system. Wasn't full independence, but he said, yeah, you could become part of the French Republic. And a lot of the countries did accept that, but some didn't. For example, Guinea-Conakry refused. So they became independent in 1958. Algeria, of course, was fighting a war of independence. They were not interested. The revolutionaries there were not interested in becoming part of France. But in 1960, they did grant independence to their former colonies, many of their former colonies in Africa. So Darko took over, and he ran the country until 1965. Then he was overthrown by the man you recently mentioned, Colonel
Yeah.
Jean-Bedel Bokassa. Very interesting political figure. And he took over in a military coup d'etat in 1965.
And how do you assess his legacy? And my follow up question to that is what was Central African Republic's place during the Cold War, and was Bukasa secretly or openly supported by the U.S., France, Canada, Britain, and its allies because he was anti-communist and anti-leftism? I'm curious your response.
Yes. Yeah, he was an autocrat. I mentioned he took over the government in 1965. By 1972, he had declared himself president for life. He had also said that the Central African Republic was no longer a republic, it was now an empire. So then in 1976, he declared himself emperor of the Central African Empire. Perhaps he was wanted to go back to the days of pre-colonialism when you had the human settlements and kingdoms, for example, that existed in the Central African region that were formidable. You know, you had the Sokoto Caliphate also interfaced with the territory that later became known as the Central African Republic. So you had Maison, you had the anti-colonial struggle that was waged back between the 1880s and the 1920s. So yes, they did want someone in there like a Bokassa, who was pro-French and pro-US and anti-communist.
Okay.
Nonetheless, he was not an effective or efficient ruler. And eventually there was internal turmoil. In 1979, there was a student rebellion that erupted in the Central African Republic because the students were required to purchase uniforms that were produced by the emperor's wife, and they had to buy these uniforms. So they went out and protested. They were met with harsh repression. Estimated that maybe 100 students were killed in 1979.
And were they protesting just out of principle that they did not want to wear these uniforms, or was it because of the fact that these? I mean, was she charging very overpriced? Was she charging very overpriced to a population of mostly, you know, poor people, and what are
Yeah,
poor people when we talk about people who actually do have jobs but are actually in poverty? So
exactly.
poor people. So is that why the students broke out in rebellion?
Yeah, it was clearly a burden on their families. And these decisions were being made arbitrarily. There was no democratic process in action, in effect, inside the country, at least since 1965. And even prior to that, because when Darko took over, he eliminated other political parties that were considered rivals of Maison. So yes, I think it was a combination of the impoverishment inside the country and also the lack of democratic practice in that country. So he was eventually overthrown, and the French played a role in his removal from office, even though he was pro-French. They figured he was an embarrassment.
Wait. So the French played a role in
Yes,
ousting Bukasa.
yes, they did.
Okay,
They
interesting,
did.
interesting.
Yeah, because he was considered an embarrassment. He was ineffective, and they figured if they didn't get rid of him, there could be a real rebellion, youth-led rebellion inside the country that could really be against French neo-colonial rule. So he was overthrown in September of 1981 by General Andre Kolinga,
Okay.
who was also a very interesting figure. He suspended what existed of the Constitution at that time. And eventually, between 1993 and 2003, well, we have to understand that in the early 90s, after the collapse of the Comecon countries in Eastern Europe and eventually the Soviet Union in 1991, there was a whole movement towards multi-party democratic rule in Africa. During the early 1990s, there were demonstrations calling for multi-party rule and so forth. So there was pressure from below, as well as from the Western imperialist countries, to establish these multi-party democratic systems. So eventually there were elections held in the CAR, and in those elections, out of that entire process, a man by the name of Ange-Félix came to power in 1993, and he was able to stay in power for a decade until 2003. But of course, there was unrest in areas outside of Bangui, which is the capital of the country. And he led a group called the Movement for the Liberation of Central Africa. This is Patasi.
And in fact, actually, you already are talking about it. So let me just just throw in this question, which is talk to us about the legacy of CAR's arguably only democratically elected leader by the name Ange-Félix Pates, who, when reading about him and the two political parties he was part of, he was fairly left-leaning. His party, the MLCP, meaning Movement for the Liberation of Central African People, reading about them on Wikipedia, and their ideology is democratic socialism, social democracy, republicanism, and anti-monarchism. They themselves would be center left to left, and they are even members of Progressive Alliance, which is a sister organization to Socialist International, even though both of them are dominated by Western European social democratic parties, which have pivoted hard to the right and have always believed in social imperialism. Now, not only that, but Pates was also associated with, or certainly the people power movements who backed him were part of a political party called Nisan, known as Movement for the Social Evolution of Black Africa, which are even more radical in a good way. And their core tenets are the following: African nationalism, Pan-Africanism of the left, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and anti-neo-colonialism, and left-leaning progressivism. They faced brutal suppression from Bukasa and were dissolved at some point, but they were later reopened in the very early 90s. So, what's Pates's legacy? And follow-up question is, what were the conditions that led to him being ousted in a military coup in 2003? So take it away from there, Abayomi.
Yeah, it was an effort on the part of the other groupings inside the country. Now, the country only has about 5.6 million people, amazingly enough, considering the geographic size of the CAR.
Yeah.
And the country has Muslim, Christian, as well as traditional religious affiliations inside the country. But all these affiliations have political dynamics. For example, the Muslim population is heavily involved in trade, internal trade, domestic markets, and so forth. So all this is very, very important to understand. The country, even in 2003, was still very much allied with French imperialism.
Okay.
And what happened was that in Haiti, in 2004, it represented the bicentennial of Haitian independence, which overthrew the French colonial system, overthrew slavery in a revolutionary war between 1791 and 1803. They became independent on January 1st of 1804. So in 2004, 200 years later, Haiti was commemorating its bicentennial.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that the only head of state that attended that bicentennial was Thabo Mbeki of the Republic of South Africa. And they, in fact, turned over resources to Haiti that was then under control of Jean-Bertrand Aristide for this commemoration. Well, of course, the US, France, and Canada had other plans.
Yeah.
And they supported opposition groups in Haiti. And there was an invasion in January of 2004 by the US, thousands of troops from the United States, from Canada, and from France. They came in and ousted Jean-Bertrand Aristide, took over the government, installed a puppet regime, and Aristide was forcefully expatriated to the Central African Republic.
Interesting. Yeah.
So this shows how this ties in. Now, he was left there stranded, and the president, Thabo Mbeki of the Republic of South Africa, offered him political asylum in South Africa. And a delegation of people, including Maxine Waters, who was a congresswoman from Southern California, went to Bangui, the capital of the Central African Republic, and negotiated with Francois Bozize for the release of President Aristide, who then was transported to the Republic of South Africa. So that gives you an idea. The fact that he would allow a Caribbean head of state to be dumped in his own country speaks volumes in terms of the character of the government there.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting episode. You see the link between French imperialism in the Caribbean, in Central Africa, and of course, the legacy of the anti-colonial, anti-slavery fight from Haiti all the way to South Africa. But at any rate, the situation continued to deteriorate in the CAR. And then you had the eruption of a civil war that lasted for about a decade. You had the rebels who were fighting against the Bozize government. And there were efforts by the African Union and other Western countries to negotiate a settlement of this. And then, of course, you had the presidential elections that took place in 2005, which Bozize won, although there were questions about the credibility of the elections. There were elections again in 2011, which he also won, questions about the credibility of those elections as well. By that time, there was a coalition called Seleka that had formed, and they began to seize towns and villages, and eventually they took over the capital in 2013. And this was a Muslim-oriented coalition. So they took over in 2013, and there were problems associated with that as well. Then there was the anti-Balaka coalition, which was a Christian-dominated coalition, which was fighting against the Seleka rebels during this particular time period. There was some efforts by the United Nations as well as the African Union to negotiate a settlement, which led to an interim government led by Catherine Samba Peza. And she stayed in power for a while. And then eventually the former prime minister by the name of Faustin Archange Touadéra became the president in 2017, I believe. And I think he still is the head of state in the Central African Republic right now. But during this time period, it's very interesting to understand uh, that the Russian Federation got involved in the security operations of the Central African Republic because of the rebels that were constantly attacking Bangui and other parts of the country. Even though French forces were there, they were not able to stop these rebel incursions. They called in the so-called Wagner Group, which now has been transformed into what they call the Africa Corps.
Interesting.
But anyway, they began to train Central African Republic troops, supplying weapons and intelligence support to try to stabilize the situation in the Central African Republic. So yes, Russia is involved there. And this is one of the earlier countries in which they got involved on a security basis. Now, we see this as becoming more widespread, whether we look at the Alliance of Sahel States and other countries too, which have brought in Russian security advisors and personnel.
Fascinating. And if but let's yeah, that's fascinating. But let's go let's go actually a little bit back in time. So interestingly enough, Paul Kagame and the many coups and acts of aggression he has led, Kagame, depicted himself as a leftist, but he is anything but. Laurent Kabila, when he ousted Mobutu, was seen to be a leftist, but both governed as a right-winger and was very business-friendly to the Western multinational corporations because it was the West that propped both of those two men up. The people who ousted Patasi and claimed he wasn't doing enough to help the majority destitute, poor, or working poor, the coup regime was led by Francois Bozis, who installed his own party into power, known as the KNK, the National Convergence. He described his party as Social Democratic Laborist Party without theory, he said. And the Kwa na Kwa, the KNK, is a working person's party in the tradition of social democracy. Its objective is to mobilize the population, raise awareness, and move towards development in the sense of the fight against poverty through work. It is only through work that we can change the situation we face in the country. The KNK is a tool to combat idleness, laziness, and laxity. It is a party different from others in the sense that it is not a party of theories. I find that fascinating, in and of itself. And the party aligns itself with the founder of the Central African Republic, Barthélemy Boganda, and appeals to his five verbs: house, feed, education, heal, clothe. And Africa Elects, which is an affiliate of Europe Elects, disputes the party's self-described ideology. It states that by Bozisi's own statements describing the party, it holds an individualist view on poverty, mainly focusing on personal responsibility, a view generally held by right-leaning or fully right-wing parties. It has also been described as holding Gabaya nationalist views, with Bozisi giving preference to Gabaya in positions of power. Bozisi himself, a Christian, has been accused of persecuting Muslim communities and driving them out of the western part of the country. Aside from this, the party has made repatriation of exiled former soldiers from the Civil War one of its main policy points. So Abayomi, I'm curious, as a journalist and Pan-Africanist leftist historian activist, how do you assess Bozisi's time in office? Has he talked from the left but governed as a far right, very business friendly to the multinational Western corporations and anyone else who plungers the Central African Republic? I'm curious your response.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that he collaborated with France, the United States, and Canada to overthrow the elected government in Haiti speaks volumes. And Maxine Waters talked about that episode in 2004. She visited Detroit, and we, organization I work with, held a mass meeting where she was one of the featured speakers. This is 20 years ago, 21 years ago, in fact, and she talked about her interaction with Francois Bozizi, and he was not progressive. The negotiations were very difficult. Nonetheless, he did eventually agree to allow John Bertrand Aristide to travel from the Central African Republic to the Republic of South Africa. But no, I would not assess his administration as progressive. And the policies that were enacted actually created more division inside the country, leading to the Seleka rebellion and all of that was associated with it, the turmoil that racked the country for many years. And eventually, though, there was some transition inside the country, but at the same time, I would not consider his government as being progressive
Fascinating.
in any way. No, even though, they may say on the one hand that, they're for, progress and so forth. But the idea of, people pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps, these are right-wing, conservative, even racist characterizations and categorizations from sociology and anthropology, where they talked about the culture of poverty, that people are poor because they have bad values, and they come from a culture of bad values. They lack personal responsibility. So you have the notion of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. So I guess the undeserving poor are those who don't try to help themselves and who, in fact, deserve, what they get or deserve the lot in which they find themselves. So it's very interesting that you have people with the history of the Central African Republic, which was subjected to German as well as French colonialism, forced labor, which was tantamount to slavery, and the theft of resources, will be advocating such an ideology.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that Maxine Waters, who has gone so much to the right in recent years. Sadly, she was supportive of Clinton over the Bernie Sanders campaign. Whatever criticisms we may have of Bernie Sanders, but that was a very real left wing challenge to the right wing Democratic establishment. So it's a pity that she's gone more to the right in recent years. But yeah, no, I have to say this as someone. I mean, I've only been to Congo and spent most of my time in Kinshasa. But I have to say this as someone who has seen with my own eyes extreme poverty,
Yeah,
and I think and I'm one of those people who I think I think the fact that I have spent time in Congo gives a very good window into much of uh, much of the continent when we talk about extreme poverty, people who are in destitute poverty, and people who, even though they do have jobs like like selling their fish in the market, selling their decorations that people can put in their house of elephants or a map of Africa with the gorilla holding it. So I have seen for myself that kind of working class, which makes up a majority of people in Congo and other parts of Africa. And for me, the idea, these are people, a lot of them who are self-employed, a lot of them who have to, whatever little money they make, they have to pay that. They have to pay for the privilege of putting their food in the market, their whatever clothing they're selling, whatever handmade craft they're selling into a market. So the idea that if people just work, that solves the issue of poverty is complete bullshit, and the idea that these people who are working their asses off and so forth, aren't working enough. It's one thing, it's one thing to hear, Europeans talk about this, about their fellow, countrymen, but to hear Africans or Latin Americans or or those in West Asia, Southeast Asia, Far East Asia, talk like this, it drives me crazy. It really drives me
Yeah,
crazy. So
but
I just,
it wins the accolades of the Western imperialists because it absolves them from their responsibility from the Atlantic slave trade all the way up to colonialism and modern day neo-colonialism. So uh, it absolves them of their responsibilities. So they don't have to apologize, for the conditions that exist today in Africa and among the African diaspora,
exactly.
because it's not their fault. It's the fault of the African people who are not doing what they're supposed to do to lift themselves up out of poverty. So, but then if you take the approach, let's say that the Communist Party of China took, um, and they took power in 1949, now they've pretty much eliminated poverty in a country of over a billion people. They're opposed to that as well. You know, they don't want Africa to learn from China or to be allied with China or Russia. So it's a contradiction in terms of their own ideological orientation. On the one hand, they say, oh, yeah, you need to be more self reliant, but then don't be like China, which, had an ideology of self reliance and still does in that
Yeah.
regard. So it's quite interesting that you should bring that up. But
Well, that's what
yeah, the Central African Republic is landlocked. They do have gold inside the country, but yeah, it's a very underdeveloped state and continues to be so. But it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next few years because uh, more and more countries are moving towards Russia in regard to security cooperation. We've seen that in the Alliance of Sahel States, the AES, and it's happening in other states as well. So
and
it'll be
it's
interesting to see if all these countries can come together
and
on some
that's
type of joint political and economic program.
exactly, actually, that's actually a perfect segue to this question. Now, Bozizi was later himself ousted in the military coup, and he was replaced by Michel uh, Dojotia. I hope I'm pronouncing his name. Apologies if I'm butchering his name. And Michel Dojogia, who, interestingly enough, studied in the Soviet Union, and he studied economic planning in the USSR. But from just reading about him on Wikipedia, he's a Muslim, and there's nothing wrong with that. But his time in office has been one where, again, he's allowed mostly Western corporations to exploit the resources of CAR, very tribalistic and sectarian himself, or at least he was accused of many human rights abuses, and they were apparently so bad that he was not ousted in a coup, but regional leaders more or less forced him to step down. So, how do you assess his legacy in Central African Republic?
Well, obviously, it was not progressive. It was not positive, and the Seleka rebel coalition was led by the Muslims inside the country, and they did have legitimate grievances, against the system that had developed there under Bozizi and even prior to him. But at the same time, what it's going to take is a collective effort on the part of all the different population groups, whether irrespective of ethnic affiliation, religion, to come together to build a united Central African Republic. And that's what's important. That's the ideology that needs to govern the society as a whole.
So my second to last question is this: how do you assess? And you already sort of talked about these two figures, but so talk to us a bit more how you assess the legacy of the last two Central African Republic leaders. So there was the acting president, Alexandre-Ferdinand Negudit, apologies if I'm butchering his name, who held some promise as he was a member of a political party, the Central African Democratic Rally, which, reading about them, their core ethos and agenda is one of African nationalism, democratic socialism, social democracy, republicanism, and they are center left to broad left. And despite him supporting Dojuta initially, he seemed to not abuse his power or engage in tribalism, but opted not to try to advance a much needed radical agenda for the country. He stepped aside to let, oddly enough, an independent politician by the name Karim Mekusla govern the country, the only other Muslim to rule the country. But interestingly enough, and darkly, amusingly enough, he fled the country in 2021 after the Constitutional Court of Central Africa Republic impeached him and accused him of participating in a 2021 coup attempt. So your response and assessment of these two leaders, I'm curious.
Well, obviously, they were not able to consolidate power. They were not able to convince people, other political forces, and people within the military that they had the best interests of the country as their objectives. So they were forced to leave, and the security situation continued to deteriorate. So now we have to see what's going to happen in the next few months, the next few years inside the Central African Republic, considering the fact that France has been under fire all across the continent. People want them to remove their military forces. Even their economic interests are being attacked. We see what's going on in Niger in regard to the uranium mines there that are owned by Orano Corporation, which is based in Paris. So, yeah, it'll be real interesting to see what happens in the Central African Republic and other countries that were formerly colonized by France during the 19th and 20th centuries. And all of these countries right now are really going through a lot of introspection. Even Cote d'Ivoire, there were rumors circulating earlier this week that there was a anti-French coup that was underway. Now, it's not clear exactly what's going on. Very limited amount of information is coming out of the country, but we've been trying to follow that situation very, very closely because we know the leader in Cote d'Ivoire has been very, very much pro-French. In fact, he was installed by France in 2011 when the former leader, Laurent Gbagbo, was overthrown by French paratroopers in exile to the Netherlands. And he and his wife were arrested. He was eventually allowed to come back, but it's still not clear what's going to happen politically inside Cote d'Ivoire. So the same situation inside the Central African Republic with all the anti-French sentiment that's sweeping the continent right now. The political leaders are going to have to reform, or else they're going to face potential military seizure of power on an anti-French basis.
Fascinating. So, last question, reflections on Central African Republic. Let me read some sad facts of that international observers and semi-NGOs have concluded about this small, rich country. It is the top 10 of poorest countries in the world. It is estimated that CAR is one of the most unhealthiest countries and one of the worst places to be a young person. According to the Human Development Index, third lowest level of human development, ranking 191 out of 193 countries. The country had the second lowest inequality adjusted human development index, ranking 164th out of 165 countries. And I don't believe in black capitalism or African capitalism. And Dr. Jared Ball of I mix what I like and Black Liberation Media has thoroughly debunked, along with two Blackman's part of Black Liberation Media, the whole black buying power mythology. But Central African Republic has one of the lowest GDPs per capita of purchasing power in the world since 2017, despite it being a non-aligned member. It's clear from the Cold War to the 90s, the period of unipolar world, to the present attempts with the rise of BRICS and people wanting a multipolar world and eradication of Western imperial order, that Central African Republic, like the rest of the continent, despite even seemingly left-wing or left-leaning parties governing, capitalism has failed. Capitalism, with whatever tribalistic, sectarian characteristics, has failed the country miserably. So, what will it take for Central African Republic to free itself of these chronic miseries and become an advanced economy, or have far more dignity in terms of its struggle to eradicate poverty, like Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and dare I say, when it comes to European countries, Portugal, Spain, or Italy? I'm curious your response.
Well, they definitely have to move towards a socialist economic orientation. And a number of the countries you mentioned have already done that. And that, as I see it, is the only real solution for Africa, not just the Central African Republic, but the continent as a whole. Even with the withdrawal of French and some U.S. forces from these countries in West Africa, and even less so in Central Africa, unity is imperative. And it's going to have to be a struggle waged against imperialism towards a continental economic and political system that can deal with its own internal crises as it relates to the attempted overthrow of governments, the destabilization of governments by the Western imperialist countries. There's no other solution than continental integration, what Dr. Kwame Nkrumah talked about and others since that time period. Muammar Gaddafi, for example, in the CERT declarations, which were drafted in Libya in 1999, which provided the blueprint for the transition from the Organization of African Unity, which was founded in 1963. We'll be commemorating the anniversary, 62nd anniversary of the formation of the OAU on Sunday, Africa Liberation Day. And the AU was formed in 2002, it's 23 years ago. So if you read the initial charter of the OAU and the charter of the AU, and you read the writings of other Pan-Africanists, such as Nkrumah, people like Ahmed Sekou Touré, Thomas Sankara, and others, yeah, they called, for African unity, for the formation of the United States of Africa. And that is what's really it's going to take in order to turn the situation around, not just in the CAR, but throughout the continent as a whole. So that's why it's positive to see what's going on in Burkina Faso now again, to see what's happening in Niger, in the AES states. So yes, that's the direction that Africa needs to move in the 21st century.
Fascinating. Well, we were joined on this edition of One Plus One, our All Things Africa edition, learning about Central African Republic with our brilliant history teacher, journalist, and Pan-Africanist leftist Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire and Black Agenda Report. Please subscribe to both outlets and donate generously to them, and please subscribe, like, and share widely all of One Plus One's content and donate generously to us as well. Next week, the country we'll be exploring is Gabon. But until then, enjoy your weekend, everyone. Good night and good luck, and all my best until then. And power to the people, death to Western imperialism, center colonialism, and that includes Zionism as well. So all my best until then.